perhaps an even more profound expression of this irony is the fact that we are fighting a war against racism abroad, and yet on the home front we see thousands and thousands of Japanese Americans put into prison camps for the duration of the war. The process of the internment of Japanese Americans during the war remains one of the serious black marks on all of American history. In the aftermath of the attack at Pearl Harbor, building from December 1941 through February of 1942, there was an incredible amount of anti-Japanese sentiment in the country. Newspapers attacked the Japanese Americans. There were lots of different opinions expressed on the radio, and just as one example, the Los Angeles Times wrote, "A viper is nonetheless a viper whenever it's hatched. So a Japanese American, born of Japanese parents, grows up to be Japanese, not an American." So there was a lot of this kind of racism and anti-Japanese feeling in the country. And some people contributed to this and helped to whip up that kind of sentiment. The most prominent of them was named General John L. DeWitt. He was the West Coast Army commander in this country, and he appeared before Congress. He spoke to President Roosevelt several different times. And DeWitt actually was considering a run for the presidency at some point down the road, and thought that this was a cause that he could attach himself to. And based on some of his arguments that Japanese Americans could serve as spies and that they might undermine the war effort and disrupt what the United States was trying to do, he convinced FDR to sign Executive Order 9066 on February 19th, 1942. This was called the Evacuation Order, but it is better known among historians now as the Internment Order. It commanded that all of the Japanese Americans on the West Coast be rounded up and put into prison camps. There were about 150,000 Japanese Americans living in the country at that time, and during the war years about 120,000 will ultimately be put into the internment camps. So about 30,000 not put into the camps, and I'll talk about that number a little bit later. And this was done very hastily. Within just a couple of months, the nation had to prepare itself to serve more than 100,000 prisoners. And the duration of this was unknown, how long they would be in the centers. And so many of them were initially put into what were called assembly centers. There were about 15 of these, which were, most of them were racetracks or horse tracks. And so people were living in the stables at those horse tracks for as much as a year before they were transferred to more permanent locations. The process of internment itself is a sad and somewhat tragic chapter in American history. You've probably read or learned a little bit about this before, but the prisoners could only take with them whatever they could carry, and so you see many pictures like this sad one here of the little girl carrying her doll and one little bag, and that's all she could bring for the next several years in which she would be living in these camps. Conditions in the camps were abysmal, and especially were overcrowded while they were in the assembly centers or the horse stables. One of the things about the period of Japanese internment is that we have an extensive record of what the conditions were like. Many of the Japanese kept diaries or written records, and there was also a steady stream of correspondence from the camps with people on the outside. And so we have lots of information about what it was like. One of the things that many of the prisoners commented on was the crowding and the cramped conditions. Typically, an entire family would be living in one room or one stable in the horse stables, about a 15 by 20 size room, which is the size of sort of a modest bedroom. Think about something like going on vacation with your family and having to live within one hotel room. Even for a night or two, it gets to be pretty crowded. But for years on end, this must have been a really distressing situation. One of the things that people commented on frequently was the lack of privacy. Here are the words of one person describing it. Loud snores, the grinding of teeth, the wail of babies, the murmur of conversations. These could be heard the full length of the stable. There were also many pests that infested the camps. Consider, again, if these are horse stables and even the more permanent camps like the one in the picture here, they're still largely exposed to the elements and the outdoors. And so insects, rats, mice, spiders, ants, and so on were everywhere in the camps. Now, these were not death camps or concentration camps. We don't see people being experimented on or certainly being systematically executed. But they did live under prison-like conditions with some of the inconveniences that I described on the previous slide. Barbed wire surrounded all of the camps, and there were armed guards or armed sentries constantly on the watch. The camps operated under curfews, and prisoners had to follow strict rules, and they were kind of circulated about from one activity to another at mealtime and so on. Any guests visiting the camps were scrutinized. Mail going in and out of the camps were scrutinized, and a lot of the letters that we have as records from this time have parts blacked out or cut out. At the same time, we really don't have any records of prison uprisings or attempts to escape. The internees, for the most part, went about their lives and tried to make things as comfortable and livable as they could. And so while we note the prison-like conditions and the discomforts that were around them, historians have also written about things like the baseball leagues that flourished within the camps, or other examples of agency among the people in the camps, that is, kind of taking charge of their own lives. There were doctors and dentists and so on within the camps who treated their fellow patients and so on. The internment of the Japanese Americans is a significant blight on our nation's historical record, and historians unanimously agree about this. There are no historians looking back and seeing any justification for their treatment. In 1983, a federal commission studied that period and determined, and this is a quote, that the broad historical causes that shaped these decisions were race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. In other words, there was no justification for that sort of treatment. Following that commission and its study, in 1988, Congress issued an apology to the survivors and ordered compensation in the amount of $20,000 be paid to those who were still living. And at that time, there were about 60,000 who were still left. So about half had died out by that time. Let me just mention one of the final ironies associated with this. And this comes back to that 30,000 or so that I mentioned did not go into the camps. There were about 33,000 Japanese Americans who fought for the United States during the war. And so you have this very interesting kind of juxtaposition of their people are being arrested and put into prison camps, And at the same time, these others are going to fight in the war and defend the country that is imprisoning their own people. And by all accounts, as with African Americans, the Japanese American soldiers fought with courage and valor, and one American general estimated that Japanese American soldiers shortened the war by as much as 2 years for their contributions in intelligence and translating and interpreting Japanese documents.